Jake Carter had spent his whole life in the wild, wide open spaces of the American West. From a young age, he learned to ride horses, rope cattle, and navigate the rugged, unforgiving landscape that became his home. The life of a cowboy wasn't for the faint of heart. It required strength, toughness, and the kind of courage that only grew with experience. Jake had all of that. He was known far and wide as a reliable cowboy, someone who knew how to handle himself no matter what the land threw at him. The sun beat down on the desert that afternoon as Jake worked tirelessly to round up a herd of cattle. He was on a stretch of land several miles from the nearest ranch, a place where the harsh, dry winds whipped across the dusty earth and where water was scarce. This was the life Jake had chosen, and he thrived in it. But even for a seasoned cowboy like him, the desert could be a dangerous place full of hidden threats. It had been a long day in the saddle, and Jake's muscles ached from hours of riding. He was focused on his task, guiding the cattle through a narrow pass, making sure none of them strayed too far. His hat shaded his eyes, but he could still feel the heat of the midday sun as it beat down relentlessly. Every step of the journey felt like a test of endurance, but Jake had been through worse before. He had weathered storms, rode through blizzards, and survived the searing heat of the desert. To him, it was all part of the job. As the herd slowly moved forward, Jake noticed one of the cows acting strangely. It was skittish, its ears twitching nervously as it walked. He squinted into the distance, trying to figure out what had the cow so on edge. His instincts told him something wasn't right. His hand rested on the handle of his lasso, ready to act if necessary. He urged the horse closer, but it wasn't until he was right on top of the herd that he saw it. A rattlesnake, its coils hidden beneath a patch of dry grass, struck with lightning speed. The snake was fast, too fast. Before Jake had a chance to react, it was already coiled around his boot. The pain was instant, sharp, fiery, and unlike anything he had ever felt. He barely had time to process what had happened before he felt the venom coursing through his leg. His heart raced as the poison spread through his bloodstream, sending a cold shiver down his spine. He tried to stay calm, but the pain was overwhelming. Jake knew exactly what had happened. He'd been bitten by a rattlesnake, and it wasn't just any snake. This was one of the most dangerous creatures in the West, a venomous serpent whose bite could kill in a matter of hours if untreated. His thoughts began to race. He had heard of people surviving snake bites before, but most of them had been in places where help was nearby. Jake was miles from the nearest ranch, and there wasn't a doctor for miles. His vision started to blur, and his breath came in shallow gasps as he fought to stay conscious. He knew he needed to act fast. The pain in his leg was growing unbearable, and every breath felt like a struggle. He could feel his strength slipping away. But even in his weakened state, Jake was determined to make it back to the ranch. He had to. If he didn't, he'd be dead before anyone even knew he was in trouble. With gritted teeth, Jake tried to stay on his feet. His horse, sensing the urgency, whinnied and began to move at a faster pace as if it knew Jake was in danger. He gripped the reins tightly, trying to steady himself, but the poison was spreading fast, and soon his head felt light, like he was floating. The world around him seemed to spin, and his heart pounded in his chest. The cowboy was no stranger to danger, but this was different. This was real. He had never been in a situation like this before. Alone in the desert with no one to help him, Jake realized just how fragile life really was. The thought of never seeing his family again, of never feeling the warmth of the sun or the freedom of the open range, filled him with a sense of dread. He had always been tough, but this was a fight he wasn't sure he could win. Despite his weakening body, Jake pressed on. He could see the distant outline of a ranch on the horizon. The thought of reaching it, of finding someone who could help him, was the only thing keeping him going. But with each step, his strength drained further. His legs felt like they were made of lead, and his vision blurred even more. His once steady hands now shook uncontrollably. The desert seemed to stretch on forever, and Jake began to wonder if he would make it. The world around him seemed to fade as he fought to stay awake. The snakebite was a battle he could feel deep inside his body, and every movement felt like a struggle. Sweat poured down his face, and the pain grew worse. He was sure his leg was swelling, and the venom seemed to pulse through his veins, consuming him from the inside out. Just as Jake thought he might collapse from exhaustion, he spotted a small ranch in the distance. It wasn't much, just a tiny homestead with a few horses grazing in the fields, but it was enough. It was Claire's place. Claire McAllister, A woman known for her strength and resourcefulness had lived alone on the ranch for years. She wasn't the kind of person to shy away from a challenge, and Jake knew that if anyone could help him, it was her. With the last of his strength, Jake urged his horse forward. He was barely aware of the movement now, everything around him a blur of heat and pain. The horse trotted on, its hooves kicking up clouds of dust, but Jake could hardly keep his eyes open. His body felt like it was on fire, and his breathing was labored. Finally, the horse came to a stop in front of Claire's ranch. Jake had made it, but he wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on. He tried to call out, but the words wouldn't come. All he could do was slump in the saddle, barely clinging to consciousness, hoping that somehow, some way, Claire would see him and come to his aid. As he faded in and out of awareness, one thought raced through Jake's mind. This was it. He was close to death, and there was no one to save him. Claire McAllister had been living alone on her small ranch for years, far from the bustling towns and far removed from the noisy crowds. It wasn't that she disliked people. She just preferred the quiet life of the open range. A rancher's life could be lonely, especially when you were a woman living in a man's world, but Claire was no stranger to hard work. She had been raised on this land and knew it like the back of her hand. Her father had passed away a few years back, and her mother had left when she was just a child. But Claire never let it hold her back. She had learned to fix fences, mend saddles, and even take care of the cattle on her own. It wasn't easy, but it was fulfilling. Every day she spent her time feeding the horses, fixing the barn, and checking on the crops. When the sun came up, Claire was already out there working, and by the time the sun set, she would be finishing up the last of her chores. There was always something to do on the ranch, and Claire was used to the rhythm of the land, the way the animals relied on her, and how the seasons changed everything around her. But that afternoon, the peacefulness of her daily routine was about to be shattered. It had been a typical day so far. The sun hung high in the sky, casting long shadows across the dry earth. Claire had just finished checking on the horses when she noticed something strange in the distance. It was hard to see from where she was standing, but there was definitely something moving toward her ranch. At first, Claire thought it was just the wind or maybe a wild animal, but then she saw it more clearly. It was a horse, and it was coming fast. As the figure grew closer, Claire could see that it wasn't just any rider. It was Jake Carter, the cowboy who worked on the nearby ranch. She didn't know him well, but she had seen him around. He was a tall, weathered man, with a calm, easygoing way about him. He was known for being a hard worker and for his quiet nature, but Claire also knew that he had been having a rough time lately. His family had recently gone through some tough times, and he had been dealing with more than just the usual challenges of ranch life. But now, seeing him ride towards her, Claire could tell something was wrong. He didn't look right. His horse was moving erratically, as if it was being pushed too hard. The cowboy himself seemed to be struggling to stay upright. His face was pale, and he was clutching his leg with one hand, his other hand desperately holding onto the reins. As the distance between them closed, Claire could see the panic in Jake's eyes. Something was terribly wrong, and she instinctively stepped forward, her boots kicking up dust as she moved closer to the horse. "Jake, what happened?" Claire called out, her voice sharp with concern. "Are you all right?" But Jake didn't answer. His body swayed in the saddle, and he looked as though he might fall at any moment. Claire rushed forward, her heart pounding. She reached out to grab the reins, and that's when she saw it. There was blood on Jake's boot. Dark, thick blood. It wasn't just blood. It was poison. Claire's eyes widened in horror as she realized what had happened. Jake had been bitten by a rattlesnake. Without thinking, Claire acted on pure instinct. She grabbed the reins of the horse and helped Jake slide down from the saddle, guiding him to the ground. His weight was almost too much for her to handle, but somehow she managed to get him down gently. He collapsed in her arms, barely conscious, his body trembling with the effects of the venom. "Jake!" Claire shouted again, trying to get a response. "Jake, stay with me. Stay awake." Jake's eyes fluttered, but he wasn't able to speak. His breathing was shallow, and his face had turned a sickly shade of green. His leg was swollen, and the bite mark from the snake was already beginning to turn purple. Claire could see that the venom was spreading quickly through his body. Claire's mind raced. She had heard of snake bites before, but she had never seen one this bad. The stories she had heard about how quickly a person could die from a venomous snake bite flashed through her mind. She knew that if she didn't act fast, Jake wouldn't make it. But what could she do? She wasn't a doctor, and there wasn't time to get him to the nearest hospital. The only thing she could think of was what her grandfather had once told her. In the old days, cowboys used to suck out the venom. It sounded crazy, almost impossible, but Claire didn't have a choice. She knew that if she didn't try, Jake would die right here, right now. Without another thought, she knelt beside him and carefully pulled the boot off his foot. His leg was already stiff and the swelling was making it hard to even touch the skin, but Claire didn't hesitate. She had to act. Claire took a deep breath, steadying herself as best as she could. She had seen enough of the land and its dangers to know that in moments like this, there was no room for fear, only action. She placed her lips over the bite wound and began to suck out the venom as quickly and carefully as she could, praying that she was doing the right thing. Jake groaned in pain, his body still convulsing as the poison worked its way deeper into his veins. Claire could feel the venom as it moved, and every second seemed like an eternity. Her heart raced as she tried to do the impossible, trying to save a man's life with nothing more than raw determination and a desperate hope. After what felt like forever, Claire pulled back, gasping for air. She had done what she could, but she wasn't sure it would be enough. The venom was still spreading and Jake's pulse was weak. She needed help, and she needed it fast. Claire knew the nearest ranch was a good 5 miles away, but there was no way she could leave Jake like this. She couldn't carry him, and she couldn't ride back fast enough. Her thoughts were a blur, but then a small idea struck her. She could use the horse. It was Jake's horse, the one he had been riding when he arrived at the ranch, and Claire knew it well. She could ride back to the nearest ranch for help and bring someone back to help Jake. But first, she needed to make sure he didn't slip away before she got back. She grabbed a clean cloth from her saddlebag and pressed it against Jake's wound, trying to slow the poison from spreading even more. She spoke to him, trying to keep him conscious. "Jake, stay with me. You're not going anywhere. Help is coming. Just hang on." As Claire mounted the horse and rode off into the horizon, her mind was filled with one thought. She had to save him. There was no other choice. Claire urged the horse into a full gallop, feeling the wind rush past her face as she sped across the dry, cracked earth. Her heart pounded with every beat, a rhythm of desperation that matched the urgency in her chest. Jake's life was slipping away, and she could only pray that she was doing enough to save him. The horse beneath her hooves moved swiftly, its powerful muscles carrying her across the open plain. But even though the animal was fast, the miles felt endless. Claire's thoughts were racing just as quickly as the horse, every second counting. Each passing minute another moment closer to losing Jake for good. She barely noticed the heat of the sun or the sting of the wind against her skin. Her mind was fixed solely on Jake. When she had seen him collapse off his horse and onto the dusty ground, she had been sure he wouldn't make it. His face had been pale, his body trembling uncontrollably. And that look in his eyes, the kind of look that made it clear that he was already fighting a battle that could take his life. The snake bite had been bad. Worse than anything Claire had expected. She had heard of rattlesnake bites before, but she had never been this close to one. It wasn't just a small wound. The venom had already started spreading throughout Jake's body, and his breathing had grown shallow and uneven. Claire had acted without thinking, instinctively remembering what her grandfather had told her about old cowboy remedies. It was a wild thought, sucking out venom, but it was all she had. She had done what she could, but now there was nothing left but to get help. As she rode, the thought of the nearest ranch kept her focused. The McGraw Ranch, about 5 miles away, was the closest place where she could find people who might know how to help. They had doctors, trained ranch hands, and the resources that could make a difference. Claire had to get there. There was no other choice. The thought of Jake lying there so vulnerable kept her urging the horse to go faster, pushing it harder than she normally would. She knew she had no time to waste, but with each stride the land seemed to stretch endlessly before her. The dry grasslands, the occasional cactus standing tall like sentinels, and the rugged hills seemed unyielding. She wondered if Jake could hold on until she got there. She couldn't help but feel a wave of doubt creeping in. What if she was too late? What if, in all her rushing, she made things worse? But there was no turning back now. Claire clenched the reins tighter, urging the horse onward. She could feel the animal's muscles working beneath her, the rhythmic pounding of hooves echoing in her ears, but she couldn't afford to relax. She couldn't afford to stop. Finally, after what felt like hours but had only been a short time, she saw the familiar outline of the McGraw Ranch in the distance. The barn, The windmill turning slowly in the breeze and the scattered ranch hands working the land came into view. Claire's pulse quickened, and she urged the horse to sprint the final stretch. As she reached the ranch gate, Claire pulled the reins hard, stopping the horse with a sudden jerk. She jumped off, her boots hitting the dirt with a thud, and ran toward the nearest barn where she could see a few workers tending to the livestock. "Ben! Jimmy!" she shouted, her voice rough with fear. "Jake Carter's been bitten by a rattlesnake. He's in bad shape. We need help now." Ben, the oldest of the ranch hands, looked up at her in surprise. His face quickly morphed from confusion to concern when he saw the panic in Claire's eyes. Without wasting a second, he motioned for Jimmy to follow him, and they both sprinted toward the horse, who was still panting heavily, waiting by the gate. "Lead the way," Ben said, his voice steady despite the rush of urgency. Claire didn't hesitate. She turned on her heel and ran back to the horse, feeling a mix of relief and fear. The McGraw Ranch was only a short ride away, but it was still another agonizing stretch that might take too long. Every second felt like a lifetime. She jumped back onto the horse, followed by Ben and Jimmy, who both mounted their own horses, ready to ride. The three of them galloped back toward her ranch, the wind now at their backs as they raced to save Jake. Claire's heart thudded in her chest, but she didn't let herself look back. She couldn't. If she did, she might lose all hope. When they arrived at Claire's ranch, it was immediately clear how bad the situation was. Jake was still lying on the ground where she had left him, his breathing ragged and weak, his face pale and covered in a sheen of sweat. The venom had already begun to do its damage. His leg was swollen and turning a deep shade of purple, and his pulse was faint. Claire quickly jumped off the horse and rushed to Jake's side, kneeling beside him. "Help him," she cried to the men. "He's fading fast. I did what I could, but I need you now. We can't waste any more time." Ben and Jimmy didn't waste a moment. They knelt beside Jake, each of them checking his pulse, feeling the heat radiating from his body. Jimmy took off his shirt and pressed it to Jake's forehead, trying to cool him down while Ben started to assess the wound on his leg. It was bad, worse than Claire had realized. The venom had spread rapidly, and they could see that it was too late for just a simple treatment. Jake would need something more, something powerful, something that only a doctor could provide. "Ben, what do we do?" Claire asked, her voice shaking. Ben looked at her, his face grim. "We need to get him to town, Claire. There's no time to waste." "Town?" Claire asked, her heart sinking. "How far?" 5 hours, Ben said. "It's the closest doctor, and it's our only option now." Claire felt a pang of dread in her chest. 5 hours? Jake wouldn't survive that long, not without some kind of immediate intervention. The panic started to rise in her throat, but she pushed it down. She couldn't let herself lose control. Not now. Just then, Claire had a thought, a terrifying, risky idea. There was a small chance, a slim chance, that she could try something else to help Jake. It wasn't foolproof, but it was better than nothing. She remembered hearing about a method once used by old-time cowboys, a procedure that involved more than just sucking out the venom. It required more strength, more quick thinking, and it was far from guaranteed, but if it worked, it could save Jake's life. Claire made her decision in that moment. "Ben, Jimmy," she said, looking them both in the eye, "we need to do this right now. It's the only chance we've got." Without waiting for an answer, she began to prepare herself for what would be the hardest thing she'd ever done. The moments felt like hours as Claire, Ben, and Jimmy worked together to try and save Jake. Every second counted. Jake's condition had worsened since Claire had left to fetch help. His breathing was more labored now, and his body temperature felt unnaturally high, radiating heat that felt like it was coming from deep inside his bones. His pulse was still there, weak and faint, but with each beat, it seemed as though his life was slipping away a little more. Ben and Jimmy quickly got to work, but Claire could see that the men were struggling to find the right solution. Their experience in ranching and farming made them well-versed in taking care of animals and minor injuries, but a venomous snake bite was different. This wasn't something they could easily fix with bandages or cold compresses. It was something far more dangerous, something that needed medical attention right away. With no time to waste, Ben moved to get the wagon ready. "We'll need to get him to the doctor in town as fast as we can," he said, his voice grim but steady. "There's no other choice." But as he spoke, Claire's mind raced. 5 hours, 5 hours to town. Would Jake survive that long? Claire had heard of people surviving snake bites before, but that was only if they received treatment quickly. She had no way of knowing if Jake would be one of the lucky few. The venom had already spread through his body, and his leg was now swollen beyond recognition. The purple bruising was growing darker, and Claire knew that every minute that passed meant the poison was taking deeper hold. Ben looked at Claire, noticing the concern etched on her face. He stepped forward and said quietly, "Claire, if we don't get him to town fast, I don't think he's going to make it." Claire nodded, fighting back the panic rising in her chest. She couldn't let herself fall apart, not now. She had to stay strong for Jake. Turning to the wagon, Claire hesitated for just a moment, unsure of what to do. But then, the memory of an old cowboy remedy that her grandfather had mentioned years ago popped into her mind. It was crazy, almost impossible to believe, but it was something that had saved lives in desperate situations like this. There was a chance, just a small one, that this might help. She'd heard that some ranchers had used a method that involved more than just sucking out the venom. It was about stopping the poison from spreading any further, by cutting the wound just enough to relieve the pressure. It was risky. It could make things worse, but it might also give Jake a fighting chance to survive until they reached town. Claire's hands trembled as she thought about it. "Ben," Claire said, her voice barely a whisper, "I think we need to try something else. It might be our only chance." Ben looked at her, raising an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" he asked, though he could tell from her expression that she was serious. "There's an old method," she explained, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's not guaranteed, but it could slow the venom down. If we don't try it now, I don't think Jake will last much longer." Ben looked at the unconscious cowboy lying on the ground, his chest rising and falling slowly with each breath. He had no time to debate. "What do we need to do?" Claire took a deep breath, gathering her courage. She hadn't done something like this before, and the thought of causing more harm was terrifying, but she knew they were out of options. "We need to make a small incision near the bite. Not too deep, just enough to relieve some of the pressure. That should help the venom from spreading too quickly. If it works, it could give us enough time to get him to a doctor." The idea of cutting into Jake's leg felt like a nightmare, but Claire had no choice. She couldn't sit back and do nothing. She wasn't about to let him die in front of her, not after everything they had already gone through. Ben, despite the gravity of the situation, nodded. "Let's do it. But we have to be quick." Jimmy, who had been standing nearby, handed Claire a sharp knife from the wagon. She took it in her hand, her fingers cold from the fear running through her veins. It was a strange feeling, holding a knife that could either save or ruin everything. She looked down at Jake's swollen leg, where the bite mark was now barely visible beneath the dark bruising. The venom had done its damage. Claire knew she had to be precise. With shaking hands, Claire carefully made a small cut just above the bite mark, trying to stay steady despite the trembling in her fingers. Blood immediately seeped from the wound, but she continued, trying not to panic. She had to do this right. If she made the wrong move, the consequences could be dire. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down as Claire focused on the task. She had heard that once the incision was made, the venom could sometimes begin to drain out. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the only thing she could think of that might give Jake the extra help he needed. As she finished, Claire gently pressed on the wound, watching carefully. A small amount of blood and venom began to seep out. She held her breath, her heart racing with hope. Was it working? Would it be enough? Ben and Jimmy looked on in silence, their faces tense with anticipation. The air was thick with the weight of the decision. If it didn't work, if the venom kept spreading, they would have no choice but to rush Jake into town as fast as they could. They would have to pray that it wasn't too late. But as Claire watched, something remarkable happened. Slowly, the swelling in Jake's leg seemed to lessen. His breathing, which had been shallow and labored, began to steady just a little. Claire's pulse quickened with cautious hope. Maybe, just maybe, the venom was finally starting to slow. "We need to move him," Ben said urgently, his voice breaking through Claire's thoughts. "We don't have much time." Claire nodded, and together the three of them gently lifted Jake into the wagon. His body felt heavy, his skin hot with fever, but he was alive. For now, that was all that mattered. They couldn't waste another second. As Ben took the reins of the wagon and started to move, Claire sat by Jake's side, her hand resting on his arm, trying to offer him whatever comfort she could. She kept whispering to him, telling him to hang on, telling him that they were going to get him to safety. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. The sound of the wagon wheels creaking on the dirt road echoed in the quiet afternoon. As they rode toward town, Claire could only hope that Jake would make it. The journey was long, but every mile was one step closer to safety. She didn't know what would happen next. All she could do was pray that the small chance they had taken, the risky choice she had made, would be enough to save the cowboy who had come so close to death. The journey to town felt like an eternity. The road, dusty and uneven, stretched on for miles, and though the wagon wheels creaked with every bump, the sound was a constant reminder of the time ticking away. Jake lay unconscious in the back, his body still feverish, his breathing shallow but steady. Claire sat by his side, her hand resting gently on his arm, praying for him to hold on just a little longer. The weight of the responsibility felt heavier than anything she had ever carried before. Every minute that passed was another minute closer to either saving Jake's life or losing him forever. Ben guided the horse at a steady pace, his face grim and focused as he drove the wagon forward. Jimmy sat at the front, occasionally glancing back at Jake, his expression worried. The three of them said little, each of them fully aware of the gravity of the situation. There were no words that could change what had already happened, no promises they could make that could guarantee a good outcome. All they could do was keep moving, keep fighting, and hope that their combined efforts would be enough. The landscape around them seemed endless, the dry, arid land stretching out in all directions. As they passed through the hills and valleys, Claire's mind wandered back to everything that had happened in the last few hours. She remembered Jake's desperate, pained face as he had fallen from his horse, the horror of seeing that venom spreading so quickly through his body. She had acted on instinct, trying the old cowboy remedy, praying it would work. But now, as they made their way toward the doctor, Claire couldn't shake the nagging fear that it might not have been enough. Every now and then, she would glance down at Jake, checking his condition. His face was still pale, but it didn't look as sickly as it had before. The swelling in his leg had decreased slightly, and while his pulse was still weak, it was there. That gave Claire a small shred of hope, just enough to keep her fighting for him. She had to believe that he could pull through. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow across the land. The air had started to cool, and the shadows grew long, stretching out over the hills as they continued their journey. Claire could feel the tension in her body begin to ease slightly, but she couldn't allow herself to fully relax. Not yet. Not until Jake was in the hands of a doctor, someone who could make sure he was going to survive. The road ahead was still long, and the uncertainty of the outcome hung over them like a dark cloud. After what seemed like hours, they finally crested the last hill before town. In the distance, Claire could see the outline of the small town, its buildings barely visible in the fading light. A wave of relief washed over her, but it was quickly replaced by a new sense of urgency. They weren't safe yet. Jake still needed help, and the doctor was the only one who could provide it. The wagon bounced over the cobblestones as they entered the town, the wheels clattering loudly against the road. Claire's heart raced as they approached the small clinic at the edge of the town. The building was modest, with a sign hanging above the door that read, "Dr. Langley." It wasn't much, but it was all they had. Claire jumped out of the wagon before it had even fully stopped, her boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. Ben and Jimmy followed her, both of them moving quickly as they rushed toward the door of the clinic. Claire didn't wait for anyone to knock. She swung open the door and they all rushed inside. Dr. Langley, an older man with silver hair and a calm demeanor, was sitting at his desk, writing something in a ledger. He looked up in surprise as Claire, Ben, and Jimmy burst into the room. "What is it? What's happened?" Dr. Langley asked, standing up immediately. "Jake Carter's been bitten by a rattlesnake," Claire said, her voice urgent but controlled. "He's been unconscious for hours. We need your help." The doctor's face tightened with concern as he looked past Claire to the wagon where Jake lay. Without a word, he motioned for them to follow him, leading them to an examination room at the back of the clinic. He didn't ask for details, he knew what had to be done, and that was all that mattered. As soon as they entered the room, Claire and the others carefully lifted Jake out of the wagon and placed him on the examination table. The doctor immediately began to assess him, checking his pulse, his breathing, and the bite mark on his leg. He moved with precision, his experience clear in the way he handled the situation. He muttered to himself as he examined Jake's condition, his brow furrowed in concentration. Snake bite, Dr. Langley said, confirming Claire's worst fears. It's a severe one. We're going to need to work fast. He turned to Claire, his eyes sharp but kind. I'm going to administer an antidote, but we'll have to monitor him closely for the next few hours. We might be able to save him, but it's going to be touch and go for a while. Claire nodded, her throat tight. She had done everything she could, but now it was in the doctor's hands. She could only hope that Jake's body would respond to the treatment. For the next several minutes, Dr. Langley worked quickly, preparing the antidote and injecting it into Jake's bloodstream. The room was silent except for the sound of the doctor's voice giving instructions to Ben and Jimmy, who stood by, watching anxiously. Claire stood at the foot of the table, her eyes never leaving Jake's face. She hadn't realized how much she had been holding her breath until she felt a small sigh of relief escape her lips. The antidote had been administered, and now all they could do was wait. Time seemed to stretch out as they waited in the sterile, quiet room. Claire held Jake's hand, her mind racing through every possible outcome. She prayed that the venom would start to dissipate, that Jake would wake up and be able to breathe easily again. She couldn't imagine what it would be like if she lost him, not after everything they had gone through. After what felt like an eternity, Jake's breathing began to steady. His pulse, once faint, grew stronger with each passing minute. The color returned to his cheeks and the swelling in his leg began to lessen. Claire felt a rush of hope flood through her as she watched him. Slowly, Jake's eyelids fluttered open and he blinked several times, disoriented. His gaze fixed on Claire, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "You're alive," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're going to be okay." Jake managed a faint smile, though his voice was weak. "I'm not done yet, am I?" Claire laughed softly, tears springing to her eyes. "No, you're not done yet. Not if I have anything to say about it." For the first time in hours, Claire allowed herself to truly relax. Jake was going to make it. He was going to survive. As the doctor continued to monitor Jake, the three of them stepped outside for a moment, giving the cowboy some space to recover. The sky had turned dark now and the stars were starting to shine above the town. They had made it. Against all odds, Jake was alive. Ben clapped Jimmy on the back, a small grin tugging at the corner of his lips. "Well, I'll be damned. We actually did it." Claire smiled too, though her heart was still racing. She had fought for Jake, and in the end it had been enough. The cowboy had come close to death, but because of Claire's quick thinking and the help of the doctor, he had made it through. Jake Carter wasn't just a cowboy anymore. He was a survivor, and together Claire and Jake would face whatever came next.